Those of you in our audience who have continuously supported our Hadassah magazine endeavors, reaching beyond our print and digital versions to our one book, one author, Hadassah's live and virtual events, which have morphed into Hadassah Magazine Presents. We appreciate those who will access this version of Hadassah Magazine Presents now in podcast form to bring you author interviews and book-based panels and audio options, and will be available on our website, hadassah.org, or wherever you get your podcasts. Books have long been a focus of Hadassah Magazine, as evidenced by our extensive book reviews. Many of our readers look to them to choose books for their personal pleasure, as well as for Hadassah and non-Hadassah book clubs across the country. We know Hadassah has had a positive impact on illuminating the space Jewish authors occupy. However, Jewish authors and Israeli authors in particular are not necessarily so revered. We have seen a disturbing rise in reports of the challenges and decline of support some have experienced within the literary world. Some publications, bookstores, and book festivals have either publicly or tacitly excluded books and individuals who are Zionists or sympathetic to Israel. At the same time, some new opportunities have arisen amid this climate. It gives me great pleasure to introduce our panelists who will discuss this mixed landscape with their personal and professional experiences. Rachel Gordan. Rachel Gordan is the Samuel Bud Shorstein Professor of American Jewish Culture and Society at the University of Florida, where she teaches in the Department of Religion and the Center for Jewish Studies. She is the author of Postwar Stories: How Books Made Judaism American. She is the 2024-25 NEH Scholar in Residence at the Center for Jewish History in New York City. Rachel is a third-generation lifetime member of Hadassah. Talia Benamy is an author and backlist manager of Philomel, an imprint of Penguin Young Readers. She is the editor of the She Persisted chapter book series based on the best-selling picture books by Chelsea Clinton and Alexandra Boyer. A children's book author herself, Talia's Twinkle, Twinkle, Hanukkah will be published in September by Workman Kids. She is also involved in the liberal Jewish political world and ran on the Hatikva slate in the recent World Zionist Congress elections. Lissette Méndez is executive director of the Miami Book Fair, the largest and most inclusive literary festival in the United States. A Jewish Cuban American with deep roots in Miami's cultural life, she helps guide the fair's programming and partnerships. She is working to expand Jewish literary programming at the fair, including a new fellowship for writers of Jewish fiction and a conversation series focused on books about Jewish life and culture. And finally, my partner, Lisa Hostein, the executive editor of Hadassah Magazine, a position she has held for almost 10 years. She formerly served as editor-in-chief of the Jewish Telegraphic Agency and executive editor of Philadelphia's Jewish Exponent. She has won numerous journalism awards, including from the American Jewish Press Association, which has also honored her with its award for distinguished service to Jewish journalism, and this year awarded Hadassah Magazine 13 Rock Hour Awards for excellence in Jewish journalism. Lisa, the stage is yours.
Okay, are we on? Okay, great. Thank you so much, Ellen, and thank you for being a wonderful chair of Hadassah Magazine. We always appreciate what you do. I am so honored to be hosting the very first Hadassah Magazine Presents at a national conference. It's very exciting. I know many of you out here are been among our loyal attendees at the virtual events that we've been doing over the past several years. And if you haven't yet gotten on board, it's not too late. Look at all your newsletters and get that information. And as Ellen said, this particular program will soon be part of our podcast series, which is relatively new. Also, something you should all explore if you haven't already. If you need help finding a podcast, find me and I'll give it to you. I'm also really delighted to be moderating this particular panel on a subject that is very dear to Hadassah Magazine's heart. We have focused on the issue of Jewish publishing in articles and in previous events, but this time we're looking at it through a different lens. And I think this conversation continues to be important. And as it shows, despite some of the challenges that clearly still exist out there for Jewish authors and Israeli authors and the mixed field that's going on there, there are some lights and bright lights out there, and we have to recognize those as well. So I'm actually going to start with a quote from Rachel's book, because I just love this quote that I came across. And I think it's something that pertains to all of us, whether we're authors, publishers, editors, and readers, which I know 99% of you are avid readers. And it goes like this. Rachel quotes the literary scholar Josh Lambert, who said, "What we read and write, edit, publish, and review has to do with who we are and who we are connected to." So I just want you to think about that, and we'll come back to that question later on. So, Talia, I'm going to start with you because you work for a major publishing company, Penguin Random House. And while you clearly can't speak for the entire publishing world, I know that you're very connected with this issue and you communicate with your colleagues. So I want you to try to give us a broad sense of what is happening in this field right now for Jewish authors and Jewish themed books.
Thank you. Can everybody hear me in the back? Okay, great. So first of all, thank you for inviting me, us, for having this panel, for having this conversation. I think there's a lot to unpack. You already alluded to, the good and the bad, and I think both are worth talking about. Some of you may have read, this must have come out about a year ago or so at this point. There is an op-ed in the Times that was titled, and I may be misquoting, but something to the effect of, "A chill has fallen over Jews in publishing." It was a difficult piece. I would not say that I agreed with every single sentence in it, but I do think it captured a vibe. It captured a sort of tone of the moment that has been trying. Publishing, and in particular kids publishing, which is where I work, is a very progressive industry. And so there has been, with all that entails, there has been a lot of anti-Israel feeling, sometimes crossing certainly the line into anti-Semitic rhetoric. I have experienced some of that directly myself. I think it's there, and it has felt uncomfortable for a lot of Jews in the industry, in particular Jews who do identify as Zionists or connected to Israel in some way. I also think there's a lot of people in the industry who may or may not exactly understand the issue in as much, depth and complexity as it requires, and who are seeing, horrible things happening to innocent women, children in Gaza, and they're upset about it. And I get that, and their heart's in the right place. And it's sometimes hard to sort of distinguish where the line is, but so it all contributes to a vibe. There have been book events that have been canceled because the author is a Zionist and the bookstore that was hosting them didn't love that, or interviews that have not been offered, or invitations rescinded to conventions or conferences. Those things have all happened. And I don't want to gloss over that, because they are out there. And at the same time, there's this sort of, fear of, was I not invited because of that, or just because I wasn't invited? Um, you know, was my book not acquired because of something I posted in support of Israel, or was it just not acquired because not every book gets acquired? So it's the sort of unknown of it all contributes to the fear as well. And I do want to talk about the good side of things too, because that is certainly out there as well. I think, and I don't want to take up too much time. I know we don't have that much time on this panel, so I will keep this brief. Um, for all the people who in the industry are saying things that feel harmful, there are other people, not just in the Jewish community, who are saying things that are helpful, um, who are saying things that are supportive. There are also, as with every situation, the loudest voices belong to the most extreme views. And the vast majority are people who are just in the middle and just want everybody to get along. And they're just not vocal because they don't want to get into the fray, but they are the majority. There's also been community that has been built among Jews in the industry that didn't exist prior to all of this. And that's been a wonderful thing. And I know we'll talk about that a little bit more in depth later on, so I don't want to take too much time on that right now. But the last thing I'll just say in terms of the good is that, when there are bad things that happen, like you may have seen a few months back, there was a list that was circulating online. Is your favorite author a Zionist? And it was meant to be a blacklist sort of list. I'm pretty sure, and I don't take away from, the authors who were featured on that list were worried like that, for their own safety, not just about sales. I'm pretty sure their sales all went up because this community came together and said, okay, this is a list, we're going to support it. When there was a book event that I know of that was canceled, not because the author was a Zionist, but the In Conversation moderator partner was a Zionist, and the book event was canceled. It was rescheduled a week later in a much bigger venue and to a much bigger crowd than it would have gotten in the first place, because our community knows how to come out and support. And that's incredible. Unfortunate that it has to be the case, but it's a remarkable thing that we can all come together and be that support. And I think that's really worth celebrating.
Thank you. Yep. So one of the unique pieces of this particular panel is that we have somebody who kind of has delved into history. And Rachel has written a really interesting book a year ago called Postwar Stories, which explores a really interesting period in our history. And you write in the 1940s and 1950s, quote, popular culture participated in the transformation in the status of American Judaism. Writers offered Jews new ways of understanding their own identities, while also reaching broader American audiences who, in accordance with their pro-democracy and anti-fascist worldview, embraced the post-war American decorum of eschewing anti-Semitism. So it seems a little ironic, right, that we're talking about a time that you focused on when discrimination against Jews, we know, was pretty prevalent, but Jewish literature actually helped Americans better understand and perhaps empathize with Jews, while today, Jewish literature and Jewish authors at times have been targets of anti-Semitism and anti-Jewish activity. So what I really want to learn from you is how this mid-century literature developed and why and how you think that it both impacted and reflected the status of Jews in America.
Thank you, Lisa, and thank you for having the vision to organize this session and invite all of us. It's wonderful to be here. The book I wrote that Lisa was talking about, Post-War Stories, is about this immediate post-World War II moment, the late 1940s and 50s. The surprise is that there's some parallels with our own moment, and part of that is that the 40s and 50s was a time when anti-Semitism and Jews were on Americans' mind, and again, we're in that moment again for different reasons. So in the 40s and 50s, it was the fact that previous to that time, there'd been plenty of anti-Semitism in the US. As we know, it was just kind of in the air. Americans were anti-Semitic and Jews expected it and accepted it. And Hitler kind of delegitimized that anti-Semitism. The response was that Americans realized, well, if our enemies hate Jews, part of what it's going to mean to be a good liberal American is that we accept and maybe even celebrate Jews and their religion. And then that sort of combines with this Cold War mentality in which Judaism is embraced as one of the American religions. So there is an interest and acceptance in Judaism that we didn't see before in the early 40s or 30s and 20s. Those were all years of intense anti-Semitism. And kind of like how after September 11th, we saw a lot of what is Islam? What do Muslims believe? World events had kind of put this religious group on the map. After World War II, there is a lot of interest in what is then being called America's third faith. And so we literally have books with titles like Basic Judaism or What is a Jew or What the Jews Believe. And some of these start out as magazine articles in magazines like Life and Look. And it becomes part of what it means to be a good liberal American to learn about Judaism. So in the book, I describe these two genres, these anti-Semitism novels, and the star in this genre is Gentleman's Agreement, a novel that some of you might know better from the movie that starred Gregory Peck and won an Academy Award. What you might not realize is in that same year, there was actually a second movie that was also nominated for an Academy Award that was also about anti-Semitism in America. So that's a sign of how of the moment anti-Semitism scene that the movie studios, who, as we know, were kind of famously skittish around Jewish issues, nonetheless were willing to pay attention to anti-Semitism. So Gentleman's Agreement is the star of this genre, but there's actually several of these popular novels about anti-Semitism published in the 40s. And this year on my NEH fellowship in New York, I've been researching and writing the biography of this woman, Laura Z. Hobson, who wrote Gentleman's Agreement. And many readers saw her name and thought, Laura Hobson, she's probably not Jewish. They loved the novel, loved the movie, and wrote to her and said, how wonderful is it that even a non-Jew like you is so morally outraged by anti-Semitism that you would write this novel? And in fact, that was the kind of country she wanted, where it wouldn't matter whether someone was Jewish or not Jewish, that everyone would consider this an American fight. And as it turns out, she actually had very Jewish roots. Her father, Michael Zemetkin, that's where the Z comes from, helped to found the Jewish Daily Forward. And her mother wrote a woman's column for another Yiddish paper. And she goes on to write many more important social issue novels. So that was one of the genres, the anti-Semitism novels, and the other books that I pay attention to are what I call these introduction to Judaism books. It's a genre that we still see around today in books like the Rabbi Shai Held has one out called Judaism is Love, and Noah Feldman has one out that's called To Be a Jew Today. These are books explaining Judaism that are meant for both Jews and non-Jews. So that's how these two popular kinds of books are explaining Jews and their religion to a mixed audience of Jews and non-Jews in the late 40s and 50s.
Interesting. I do want to ask you, when your book was published or when you were pitching your book, did you have any trouble selling it and getting it acquired? And likewise, after it was published, we know that a lot of authors have gotten backlash, bomb reviews, which means people post bad reviews on Amazon or Goodreads. Did you experience any of that?
I did not, and I, haven't seen it among my academic friends and Jewish studies colleagues all over the country. I've heard nothing like that. And just to draw the parallel again, in the post-war period, 40s and 50s, that was actually in some ways a much more positive time for Jews in publishing, I feel. Before the post-war period, publishing houses that were important and successful were mostly Protestant owned, like Harper's, Putnam, Scribner's. And it's in the 40s and the 50s that Knopf, founded by Alfred and Blanche Knopf, and Simon and Schuster, founded by Richard Simon and Max Schuster, and Viking, founded by Harold Ginsburg. These are all Jewish founded in the 20s mostly, and Knopf leads. He founds his firm, I think, in 1915. At the time, he doesn't think that a Jewish-owned firm is going to be able to win over American authors, so he goes to Europe and gets some really important authors, Thomas Mann, Kafka, Albert Camus, and the other Jewish firms follow his lead because Knopf is really considered one of the most prestigious. So by the 40s and 50s, we're into a pretty positive time for Jews in publishing.
Interesting. So, Lissette, we've talked a little bit about how book festivals and book stores have excluded or targeted Jewish authors. And here in Miami, you're doing the exact opposite. You run a very prestigious book fair, the Miami Book Fair, and you've not only not excluded, but you've actually taken to highlighting Jewish and Israeli authors. So I want you to tell us a little bit about what it is that you're doing specifically, but most importantly, why? Why are you doing this?
Thanks so much, Lisa, for inviting me, my fellow panelists, and all of you for being here and actually listening to this. So I've been with the Miami Book Fair going on 22 book fairs, 22 years, and I've proudly been part of every aspect of what making the book fair happen is like. And, Miami, I grew up in Cuba. I came from Cuba when I was a child, and I've grown up in Miami Beach my entire life. So I've lived in a kind of a bubble. And my family, who is in New York, I was mentioning, lives in Forest Hills, across the street from 4 or 5 different synagogues, all for every every kind of Jewish person you could want. So I've never thought twice about being Jewish or being in spaces that could feel anti-Semitic, except that I have witnessed it personally, even living in a very, very, very Jewish community, being, a speaker and I have an accent and, I blend in, I pass. So very early on, I felt comments were being directed not at me, but about other Jewish people that were in the area or the neighborhood or, tropes that we all know of. And so I was kind of like a silent witness to what was going on around all of the years when maybe we had all kind of forgotten, right? So I love that you talked about the 1950s and 40s as being this sort of like golden age for being Jewish in America. And I think that really did last into, I don't know, October 5th or maybe 6th of 2023 for many of us. And so Miami Book Fair, for those of you who are familiar with it, if you're from here, from Miami, we're the largest, book festival in the country. And we've always had a lot of Jewish, thank you, audience members. Thank you. A lot of Jewish people who come, a lot of members are Jewish, or one of our co-founders or the person everyone knows is Jewish and owns the bookstores here in Miami. And so we've had a lot of Jewish representation over the years, but I never thought twice about it. I never said, okay, Jewish author, click. But I did spend all of those years, 20 years, making sure that we were representing Black voices, Muslim voices, any other voice, you name it. We've made sure to platform those writers, and so after what happened, I was kind of shocked at the sort of the kind of full rejection of Jewish people or Jewish life by most of everybody that was not Jewish, that had any kind of political or cultural thought, right? Because I mean, there's a lot of people, you go to Publix or whatever, people are not necessarily, you don't know what they're thinking, but amongst in the literary circles, right? Like Talia said, where there's a real progressive mindset, which we were always really proud of. There was all of a sudden all of these folks that were coming out very virulently anti-Jewish, and I was just like, I was shocked and I was upset. And I decided, Molly, thank you so much. My colleague, Molly, who's sitting there, Molly and I sat down at one point and I said, you know what? Even though we've had all these Jewish authors all the time, I'm going to make a special emphasis to highlight that they're here. And I'm going to go one step further. And we were talking about Amir Tibon, who is a friend of Talia's, but who was one of the kibbutz that were attacked, and so I decided again that we were going to invite him and he was going to be the opening uh, speaker, the opening author at the fair last year. And, I'm there was all kinds of mixed feelings from different kinds of people. For the most part, everybody was supportive. I also have to say, I guess I don't really mostly care what anybody says or thinks. As long as I'm employed, I'll do I'll do it until somebody kicks me out, and then I'll go do it someplace else. And so, we had someone that quit, because they were so against us bringing an opening day author who was Israeli and who was Jewish, and I was like, well, good luck, and kept going. And I think it was all very well received by our community. We didn't get any backlash, but I know that one of the things that spurred me were those lists, right? I didn't dwell on whether the lists were there or, oh my God, I was like, immediately I saw one name on one list of an author who was signing on, to condemn something, condemn Israel's response, condemn something. And an author I knew, who I've had at the fair, who was in our community, and I was just so appalled that like I didn't spend any more time looking for any more lists or for any more anything. I just knew that what I had to do was the opposite. I wasn't going to sign my name to a list because that's so easy to do. I was going to put my job if it needed to be. I was going to put my reputation if that needed to be. I was going to put everything that I had of 21 years of work on the line if I had to, in order to highlight the books and the authors that were representing Jewish life and culture in all of its facets. I must add that we're not just talking about one specific point of view, or just run the gamut from children's books to books for adults. It's different kinds of conversations, and I mean, that's how it all started. And it was successful. I think somebody in the earlier panel mentioned, how could you support? Well, funding. Well, funding is a big deal for us as a nonprofit who doesn't get support from especially now, from government sources, as the funding for arts and culture has been cut in Florida in such a drastic way, even in Miami-Dade County. But there was one family foundation who saw what we were doing, and at the very last minute saw what we were doing. They were not familiar with us before. They're new to Miami, and they supported financially. And then from there, things grew. I met someone who was at the fair last year just as a visitor, and really, felt strongly about what we were doing to highlight Jewish arts and culture, and she, you know, she invited me to a conversation, and now the program is growing. This year, in addition, to the books and the conversations that we've always had and are highlighting, we're also launching a fellowship, a 1-year fellowship for writers, for a writer, because it's a live in Miami kind of fellowship, working on fiction about Jewish life and culture in some way. Again, we are being we're casting a wide net for what that means. And then we're also launching a monthly series, a kind of book club monthly series where we'll partnering with the Jewish Book Council and their brand new initiative, the Jewish Book Club, which will send out a box with a book every other month to members, to people who sign up. I don't know how far they've announced this, but they will be one of our partners, and we'll be using some of those books. So I think overall, um, we just have to go out and do what we feel is right for ourselves and our community, because I think it's been proven time and time again through history, as Talia mentioned, as you mentioned, that if we don't do it, no one else is going to do it for us. And really, if we don't just continue doing everything that you ladies are doing, right, and have been doing for these 100 years, it's never going to end. It didn't end. I think we forgot that, in Miami, at least in Miami Beach and at Turnberry and Aventura, we forgot, and we can't, never again means never again, and that is really just a big never again, not just the Holocaust.
It's really, when I discovered this, I was just amazed because we're having these conversations about all the bad things that are happening. And like Talia said, it's, the good and the bad. But this was just so astonishing to me. So I'm so happy that we were connected. In fact, Lizette has invited me to moderate one of the programs in November. So I'm going to be happy to do that. And I will also tell you, because she might not mention, so I'm going to be interviewing Pam Nadell, who's a history professor at American University, who's coming out with a new book on anti-Semitism. And Lizette and her team have chosen that book to feature in a college program that they do at Miami-Dade University, which is a primarily non-Jewish student body. So here she's bringing this important book about anti-Semitism in America to a college. So it really, it's just so admirable what you're doing, and very, very heartwarming in this very difficult environment. So I want to talk a little bit about Israeli authors, because I think there's also a little bit of a dichotomy, because books are being published. I mean, we are still getting lists and lists of and press releases about Jewish books being published. So that's the thing. It's not like they're not being published. And even Israeli books are being published. Most of them, I think, more nonfiction than fiction. But we do know of several instances where Israeli authors who have been very prominent in the past, who didn't get the reviews this time around, or got review bombed, or didn't. So Lihi Lapid, for instance, who's an Israeli author, happens to be the wife of Yair Lapid, the opposition leader in Israel. She came out with a book that had a huge book deal. Came out like October 2023. Nobody would even host a launch party in New York City for her. And that's the kind of thing Ayelet Sabari, who we featured in a recent program, came out with a wonderful book last year called Songs of the Brokenhearted. And she was not invited. She lives part-time in Canada, part-time in Israel, and she was not invited this year to a Canadian book festival. So you can ask, like Astalia did they just not like this book? Did they just not, but she felt it was a snub because she had always been invited to this festival. And as I'm sure many of you know, there was a huge letter that was sent around last year, basically a boycott of Israeli culture, signed by very prominent authors, very upsetting. I had literally just finished reading Percival Everett's book about James, which is a fabulous book. Maybe you read it. His name is on that list, as are other really Sally Rooney authors that we love and have really cherished. So then, of course, there was a counter letter by a group called Community Activist Creative Community for Peace, which has formed essentially to combat anti-Semitism in the publishing world and the creative world in general. So this is a phenomenon. And Lissette, I know that you have a couple of Israeli authors coming, but I would like any of you to really comment on what you think the distinction is. I mean, I guess in some ways it's pretty obvious if, most of this anti-Semitism is coming from anti-Israel sentiment anyway. So maybe it's just easier to target them. But is there some nuance that you're seeing in the publishing world related to Israeli authors versus Jewish authors?
So it's an important question. I would say a few things. Thing one is, letters like that boycott letter are incredibly painful to see and to read and to know who has signed on to. And it's also important to think about their impact beyond the emotional, right? What they are trying to do is say, "Hey, publishing world," whether it's a particular conference or publishing house or whatever, don't sign Israeli authors or Jewish authors or Zionist authors or whatever the case may be. Um, I haven't seen any of that actually happen. I haven't seen a publisher say, "Okay, I'm listening." I haven't seen a convention say, "Okay, I won't," directly. Now, is it possible that some of them are indirect? Sure. Um, but the direct vocal impact of letters like that has not been seen, and I think that's really important to recognize that nobody is coming out and saying, "Okay, yes, I agree." Nobody with the power to make the decisions. I think that's really important. I think it's a really important thing to know that, those of us who are looking, and I can tell you that I have been looking pre and especially post October 7th to publish Jewish voices and Israeli voices. I've been allowed to do that. I mean, I am lucky in that, my boss is also Jewish and has supported me, but also all the powers that be who have to sign off on the financials and the publishing bosses who have to approve the books that I acquire have allowed me to do that, have not batted an eye. There's not, to my knowledge, been any, "Oh, this author is Israeli, maybe we shouldn't." To the opposite, really, actually. There's one book that I can't actually talk about yet because it hasn't been announced, but it's an Israeli author who needed extra. I'm trying to think of what I can say. Who needed extra guarantees written into her contract about a particular element of it, and there wasn't a question, it happened. Like, there was support. Um, I talked earlier about the fact that we have communities that we've built up in publishing amongst Jews. At Penguin Random House, I chair the Jewish ERG, which is an employee resource group. It's like an affinity group for a particular community. We formed it after October 7th. A Muslim ERG formed at the same time as well, uh, both with full support of the publisher. We have brought in anti-Semitism training. We are working on bringing in Zionist education training with the full support of the publisher. So I think there's been some really hard things to hear, and it's also important to see where the actual impact lies.
No, that's a really important point. You hear from both ends because Deborah Harris, who runs like the biggest publishing agency or the publishing agent in Israel, but she works with getting Israeli authors published here, getting Israeli authors translated into other languages. She wrote a piece in the New York Times, and we actually had an interview with her on our last issue, and she really paints a very dismal picture. I mean, she says that she has not been able to sell nearly the number of books that they have in the past. And she worries that new Israeli voices, some of the authors who are already out there are accepted and they have a following, but that new voices are going to be quashed. And she also, indicated that she has heard a lot from American Jewish writers who are having trouble working with agents here. Now, I think you actually worked with somebody, right? So tell us that.
Yes. So the Deborah Harris Agency is my agency as my author self. Rena Rossner is my agent. She is the agent of this book. We sold it after October 7th to a Jewish editor because that was important to me. It would have been important. It was important prior to October 7th as well. Just, to publish this book as well as could be. I think, and I don't take away from, what Deborah has said. I think there's also, we've talked in previous conversations about the idea of sort of this thing called like soft silencing. The question of, is a book not being acquired because the publisher is just not sure if it's going to be a headache, right? Like, it's not that it's a good book or a bad book, but publishing is an industry. It's a business. We have to make money, and if the book is going to be more work than is worth the money made, then that's a financial decision, not an anti-Semitic decision. And I think one of the things I go back to, we as a community support ourselves. One of the things you all can do is buy Jewish books, right? Show that there is a Jewish audience out there, a market for these books. Buy the books, feature the authors in whatever your communities are, in your book clubs, and your community centers, and your JCCs, and your Hanukkah story times. And but truly, just showing that there is an audience out there, a market out there, and not just for books about like the Holocaust, and not just for nonfiction about World War II or October 7th or anything in between, but for Jewish joy. And I don't mean to just be promoting my own book, but for Jewish joy and for Jewish stories that run the gamut of Jewish experience, like Lissette was saying.
Right. You actually took my last question, which was really a good one, and we're going to be talking about that as well. Unfortunately, we're running out of time, so I want to close going back to that quote, Rachel, that you had in that book, because I just found it so meaningful. I want you all to actually comment on it. Again, what we read and write, edit, publish, and review has to do with who we are and who we are connected to. What do you take away from that, Rachel?
For me, that quote was very much about how books are products and parts of communities. Even the author themselves, I think we sometimes have a myth of a solitary writer. And in fact, as I found in my research of many Jewish writers, their books are so much the result of networks. That I mean, not just that they had a literary agent who expressed interest, but often they had a non Jewish editor who had confidence in this book. And for the Jewish writer to hear from a respected non Jewish editor, this is good, this is interesting. Many people, not just Jews, need to and read this and are going to be interested in it, was a confidence booster just because all writers kind of suffer those doubts as they're writing. So I found that too to be the case with the writers writing their friends or showing drafts and getting encouragement from other writers and friends and editors and people in the publishing world. So those connections, not to mention also from the readers, as Talia was just saying, the importance of readers who are making their interests clear through what they're buying and writing into magazines and writing to the publishing houses and the authors themselves to express their appreciation and support. So again, books really take a community, they express that there's a community of interest.
Lizette.
So in terms of Israeli versus, just American Jewish or other kinds of Jewish authors, I tend not to make that distinction myself. I feel like I'm an American citizen. Sometimes I agree with my government, sometimes I don't agree with my government, sometimes I agree with the Israeli government, sometimes I don't. But I think by and large, people are using that distinction as it's almost like a false distinction. I don't know if I'm making any sense, but I think people are like, "Oh no, we're just anti-Israel," but in fact, they still harbor that little bit of like anti-Semitism that it just gets baked in as you grow up in whatever environment. It's just baked in. I hate to say it, but I've witnessed it. So when we were looking at the list, we weren't really thinking, okay, we're going to bring in Israeli authors on purpose. We were just really looking at all of the books that were coming out this year and that were really good books and that we thought people had to listen to. But we do have a number of Israeli authors coming. Lee Lapid is one of them that Lisa talked about, and because I have no memory anymore, Stuart Nadler is another one. Tehila Hakimi, Ido Geffen. There's a whole list of authors, and we'll have our website soon. But I was going to make one last final point because I think we were talking about, and Talia mentioned, to bring, supporting your Jewish writers, your Jewish books, your Israeli writers of books, etc., is very important. Buy the books, bring them into your places. But one big reason for me to really start this program in a visible way was that I've always felt that we talk to ourselves a lot. We go to JCCs to talk to each other about whatever. We go to shul, we go to, I don't know, Hadassah conferences. There's a lot of Jewish organizations, and we all meet at those Jewish organizations to talk about whatever we're going to talk about. But I did not see enough non-affiliated spaces, non-Jewish specific spaces, if any, doing specifically Jewish work or Jewish literary work in my case. And that was the reason why I wasn't going to take this program to the JCC as much as I love the people at my JCC and in my neighborhood or whatever. And this is why I'm also not taking any part of this program to a synagogue or another kind, federation or whatever. I'm keeping it if it's, at Miami-Dade College, which is where the book fair takes place and that is home to the book fair. If somebody wants it at, wants something to happen at FIU, I'll take it to FIU, but not the Jewish Museum at FIU, because again, I just don't want us to talk to ourselves anymore because we know we're Jewish and we know we're great, but we need to make sure that the rest of the world knows it as well. Yeah.
Talia, I'm going to give you the last word. What does it mean to you to know, to be conscious of what we read, what we publish, what we edit?
Yeah, so I think a few things. I think, books with Jewish stories will often resonate more with Jewish audiences, and that makes sense. But to your point, I think books that tell Jewish stories, Jews are people, right? So like our stories are people's stories, and there are such universal themes within them, that if done well, and we hope our books are done well, they do resonate. They should resonate. They can resonate. And so I've edited a couple of books now by they're young adult fiction by an author named Isaac Blum. His first book, which was called The Life and Crimes of Hoodie Rosen, was longlisted for the National Book Award, won the Morris Award, which is an ALA award. These are not Jewish awards. This is a book that came out and took the YA world a little bit by storm, and it's about an Orthodox Jewish boy who's just trying to figure out what he's doing in the world. But isn't every teenager trying to figure out what they're doing in the world, right?
Yeah.
So it's universal in that way. And I think telling Jewish stories is part of telling human stories, and making sure that we are adding our voice to the sort of collective humanity is incredibly important.
That's a wonderful note to end on. Thank you all so much for this conversation. I'm going to call Ellen back up.
Thank you, Lisa. Thank you, panelists. Not necessarily a rosy picture, but not completely bleak either. It's one that we need to see and understand. We will always have hope that through education, advocacy, and determination, and a refusal to accept things the way they are, we will persevere and continue to make a positive impact on the world.